The mob finally converged on the great theater, having seized en route 2 Macedonian companions of Paul, Caius and Aristarchus. Most of the crowd, as is usual on such occasions, had no idea what the disturbance was all about, except, perhaps, that some visitors had insulted their goddess. As always, the Jews were the most apprehensive. That was the reason why they inevitably hated Paul. Although they thought that all Gentiles were destined for Gehenna, they managed to keep up reasonable relationships with them. Then along came these maniacs, and particularly this one Saul, who invariably managed to cause an uproar. They knew perfectly well that Artemis of Ephesus was an evil idol, the kind of image that all their prophets had warned them against, but they kept that knowledge to themselves. A Jew called Alexander, who was clearly one of the leading men in the community, was asked by the others to try and explain that it was not they who were to blame, but only a dissident handful, for whom they themselves had no respect. This Alexander may well have been the metal worker to whom Paul refers in harsh terms in his second letter to Timothy. In any case, he was a brave enough man to face the howling crowd in the theater, all of whom must certainly have known that the Jews did not believe in their goddess. He was not to get a hearing. As soon as he stepped out to speak, and they recognized him as a well-known Jew, they all began to chant, "Great is Artemis of Ephesus." The uproar went on for 2 hours. It was only quelled in the end by the arrival of the clerk of the city, a man who clearly knew how to handle a crowd. First of all, he soothed them by pointing out that everyone knew that Ephesus was the keeper of the temple of great Artemis, and of the sacred stone that fell down from heaven. The reference is interesting. The whole origin of the cult on this site had derived from centuries past through a meteorite having fallen here. He then went on to warn them not to do anything reckless. He added that if the Guild of Silversmiths had any justifiable complaint, then they knew well enough that there were regularly constituted courts where such issues could be heard. He pointed out that for all the citizens of Ephesus there was a danger that they would be accused of rioting, and everyone knew that the Romans had a heavy hand when it came to any serious disturbances of the peace. That was quite enough to send them all away silent and subdued to their homes. Paul was the root cause of the whole affair. There can also be no doubt that, had he been permitted, he would have been the first to stand up and address the crowd. The likelihood is that he would have been torn to pieces. It is significant that immediately after the episode he left the city. Indeed, some of the provincial authorities who liked him, and may well have become converts, had warned him not to show himself in the theater. It was they, too, most probably, who advised him to leave. He had been in Ephesus for 2 years. Even though it ended, as usual, in a storm, he could feel confident that, confronted by one of the greatest strongholds of pagan belief, he had managed to establish an active cell of Christians, and to have caused a number of others to doubt the whole concept of their fertility goddess. It seems perhaps strange that a message of peace and love should constantly have ended in violence, but the fact was that Paul was challenging thousands of years of accepted beliefs. People are unwilling to rethink their emotional heritage. For one thing, it requires a considerable intellectual effort. While Paul was in Ephesus, something that mattered very greatly to the whole of the empire had happened. The Emperor Claudius had died. Some said that he had been poisoned by his wife, the poison having been administered in a dish of mushrooms, his favorite food. Poisoned was always a way of describing the death of anyone rich and powerful in the ancient world, when medical knowledge in any case was in its infancy. At the same time, it is not unlikely that his wife Agrippina, a woman whom he had described as unchaste but unchastened, had a hand in his death. Despite his physical deficiencies, he had been a good ruler, a man who had tried to administer his vast empire with justice and common sense. Paul, who possibly heard the news while in Ephesus, may not have realized that the death of this Roman was going to have an important bearing on his own life. Not that he valued it very much, but he certainly wanted to use it to its fullest extent. Claudius was 64 when he died, and he had been 14 years on the throne of Rome. It has been remarked before that the great and successful years of Paul's activities occurred during the reign of this emperor. This was not entirely a coincidence. The administration had been good. The highways, byways, and seaways of the empire had been policed and made safe, and justice had been well administered. Paul owed his life on many more than one occasion to the impartial hand of Rome. The man who succeeded Claudius had been adopted by him because he was the son of his wife Agrippina, by a previous marriage to a certain Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, the latter name meaning red beard. Tradition had it that the founder of their family had been blessed by the gods, who had turned his black beard to a bronze color. The new emperor's name was, in full, Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus. Of one of his ancestors, it had been said, when he celebrated a Roman triumph riding on the back of an elephant, "Why should his bronze beard surprise us? He has, after all, a face of iron and a heart of lead." His great-great-great-grandson was to show similar characteristics, although in rather a different fashion. Suetonius says of Nero's father that his character was completely despicable. On one occasion, when driving through a village on the Appian Way, he whipped up his horses and quite deliberately ran over a boy. When one of the knights criticized him frankly in the forum, he gouged out his eyes on the spot. Shortly before the death of Tiberius, he was charged not only with treason, but adultery and incest, with his sister Domitia Lepida. The emperor under whom Paul, as a Roman citizen, was to live out the rest of his life, had a disastrous genetic background. His mother, Agrippina, the notoriously unfaithful wife of Claudius, was as violent, sadistic, and temperamentally unstable as her first husband. Nero's father, on being congratulated on the birth of his son, had himself remarked that any child by him and Agrippina was certain to be a curse to the state, and a monster as well. Otto Kiefer, in his Sexual Life in Ancient Rome, makes the following comment: "It is certain that Nero was afflicted with a grave hereditary taint. The young Nero developed sexual characteristics so numerous and so conflicting that it is astonishing to find them all in one and the same person. A preliminary summary would be this: Nero was a good husband, who nevertheless had strong homosexual tendencies. In addition, he had many extramarital relations with women. His character also contained sadistic elements. The fact remains that he was also an accomplished singer, poet, admirer of the opera and drama, and a great lover of architecture, who did much to beautify Rome and other cities of the empire. One of his ambitions, and a very sensible one, was to drive a canal through the Isthmus of Corinth, so as to connect the Aegean Sea with the Ionian and the western Mediterranean. This, in fact, was not achieved until the 19th century. The rocky nature of the terrain could not be mastered by the manpower and relatively primitive tools at the disposal of the Romans. At the same time, as a completely irresponsible master of the world, he was somewhat like Tiberius in his private life. The following translation by Robert Graves is from the 12 Caesars of Suetonius. Nero practiced every kind of obscenity, and at last invented a novel game. He was released from a den dressed in the skins of wild animals, and attacked the private parts of men and women who stood bound to stakes. After working up sufficient excitement by this means, he was dispatched, shall we say, by his freedman, Doryphorus. Doryphorus now married him, just as he himself had married Sporus, and on the wedding night he imitated the screams and moans of a girl being deflowered. Sporus was a beautiful boy, whom Nero had, theoretically at any rate, turned into a girl by castration, and with whom he had gone through a formal wedding ceremony. Suetonius quotes a current Roman joke that if only Nero's father had married that kind of wife, the world would have been a much better place. His famous Golden House in Rome contained a statue of himself over 100 feet high, with an immense swimming pool surrounded by innumerable buildings, so that the whole edifice resembled a city more than a house or even a palace. All of the dining room had ceilings of fretted ivory, the panels of which could slide back and let a rain of flowers or of perfume from hidden sprinklers shower upon his guests. The main dining room was circular, and its roof revolved slowly day and night, in time with the sky. Sea water, or sulphur water, was always on tap in the baths. When the palace had been redecorated throughout in this lavish style, Nero dedicated it, and condescended to remark, "Good, now I can at last begin to live like a human being." At about this time another human being, a balding, bearded little man, was about to set off with a few companions on a coaster bound for the port of Troas. He had been responsible for a great riot in the city of Ephesus. He was undoubtedly a troublemaker. Nero did not even know of his existence. 33. A chosen course. He was a traveler in time as well as in space. Paul's almost obsessional movement throughout Eastern Europe cannot be compared to that of explorers in later centuries. Christopher Columbus, for instance, was inspired by a dream, at the back of which lay the hope of a large fortune. Francis Drake was inspired by a desire for revenge on his enemies, at the back of which lay the hope of a large fortune. Paul was seeking no fortune in the worldly sense. His activities over these years can only be interpreted in the light of that blinding light which had struck him on the Damascus road. In Macedonia, he found the inevitable trouble of false readings of his message, and it was always his message. When it came to other interpretations being put upon it, his fury knew no bounds. His energy, as shown both in his letters and in his life, is astounding, especially when one remembers that he was often very ill. From Macedonia, he went south into Greece, where he stayed 3 months. All this, done on foot, on mule-back, or on the unsteady decks of small sailing vessels, would have taxed any man. If in his heart he was a dreamer, a romantic, a poet, yet he was always the practical businessman. The success of the organization that he managed to create in his travels might well be compared with that of a brilliant traveling sales manager. Paul was the embodiment of energy, yet none of this was directed towards worldly advancement. In the final analysis, one can only say that practically no one, except of a desert race, could have concentrated so much vitality and power towards a goal that seemed impossible. Paul had known the desert in his early years after his conversion, but he had been born in slothful and sleazy Tarsus. His extraordinary ability for concentration upon abstract thought can only be traced to his Semitic ancestry. The Semites, good men of commerce, have at the same time always possessed the ability to devote themselves to a dream. Acts give the full pace of his travels in its usual succinct fashion. He was on the point of leaving Greece for Syria when he found out that there was a Jewish plot against him. He decided to go back through Macedonia. With him went several of the companions. We sailed from Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He went back again to Troas, where he found Timothy, among others, waiting for him. Troas, relatively unimportant today, seemed then to have some significance which at first sight escapes one. And then one realizes that apart from being quite a thriving port, it had this regular influx of Roman tourists bound for Troy. And Troy was the legendary home of Aeneas, in his turn the legendary founder of the Roman race. Paul liked seaports because there were no better disseminators of information than sailors. They traveled all over the empire, and a few converts made among their fraternity meant that in due course dozens of others would hear the word in places as far apart as Italy, France, and Spain. It was on this last visit to Troas that there occurred the famous episode involving the young man called Eutychus. On a Saturday evening, Paul and all the other members of the community were gathered together for the communal fellowship meal. Afterwards, Paul addressed all those in the room and kept speaking until midnight. The room in which they met was probably in one of the typical tenements of the time, 3 stories high, and all built around a central courtyard. Eutychus was sitting in one of the window embrasures, and Paul's incessant monologue, probably coupled with the fact that Eutychus had had a skinful of the good local wine, made him nod off. Finally, he went completely to sleep and fell out of the window. Everyone rushed down and pronounced him dead. Paul motioned them back, threw himself upon the supposed corpse, and told them not to worry, that there was still life in him. To their astonishment and vast relief, they found that what he said was true, and took the young man home. Eutychus was a great deal more fortunate than the other young man mentioned in Homer's Odyssey, who was named Elpenor. He got drunk on the night before Ulysses and his friends left Circe's island and went to sleep on the roof. Waking in the morning, he forgot to take the right way down by the long ladder, and fell headlong from the roof and was killed. Ulysses, unfortunately, did not have Paul's healing gifts. The 2 stories, however, are so similar that one cannot help remarking a kind of resemblance between Homer's famous Greek wanderer and the Jewish wanderer described in Acts. Paul knew in his heart that he had not much more time left. He could, as it were, see the end of the road, lying not very far away. It is significant that when he, Luke, and the others left Troas, all except Paul went down the coast to the town of Assos by ship. Paul, at his own request, walked the 20 miles or so alone. He had determined in due course to go back to Jerusalem, and from there he was equally determined to go to Rome. He must first of all return to the sacred city, the place where Christ had died. But beyond that always lay the ultimate objective, Rome. He did not want the bustle and the squalor aboard the little coaster, even with his close friends. He needed to walk not this time with a view to making any converts, but to think out his position and the way ahead. All along his way over the years, whether in Corinth or Philippi, wherever he went, he had felt the hand of the Sanhedrin close at his shoulder. He knew that the return to Jerusalem would mean probably another scourging, almost certainly arrest, and quite definitely an attempt to have him put away altogether. But that, as he well knew, unless it was done by assassins, was something beyond the Sanhedrin's power. He knew also that he always had one recourse. As a Roman citizen, he could take his appeal against whatever charges were laid against him to the highest court of all, to the emperor in person, and that meant a voyage to Rome, at the government's expense. He came to Assos, to that enormous rocky outcrop dominated by its temple to Athena. He had thought out his position and made his decision. Throughout Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece, he had left thriving communities, and by his constant instruction in his letters, he had done his best to ensure that his message was not corrupted, and that each and all of these various cells paid their contributions to the Mother Church in Jerusalem. He had not failed James the Just in that. He joined the ship in Assos, and they coasted down to lovely Mytilene, the capital and main harbor of Sappho's Lesbos. The poetess had been dead many centuries, but they still sang her songs to the lyre in the island where the head of Orpheus had been washed ashore. The olive groves whirled like dancers. A day later, they were at Chios, home of the mastic plant, whose hard oval tears were highly prized for their supposed medicinal properties. From here they went on to Samos, birthplace of Aristarchus, who, thousands of years before Copernicus, had come to the conclusion that the sun was the center of the solar system, and that the earth, like the other planets, moved around it in essentially circular orbits. One wonders what Paul would have made of that. Another one of these ignorant Greeks? Their next port of call was Miletus, city of the 4 harbors, whose inland territory was rich in sheep, from which the local craftsmen made the famous woolen fabric, the Milesia Velera. Once a great maritime state, it was still, at the time that Paul visited it, a thriving commercial port and city. It had been the birthplace of philosophers like Thales, who died in the 6th century B.C., a man who had enough scientific knowledge to predict an eclipse of the sun, Anaximander, who had maintained that the infinite is the source of all things, and such early Greek historians as Hecataeus. A city of culture as well as wealth then, but it was not for this reason that Paul visited it. He wanted to get in touch with the leaders of the church in Ephesus, some 20 miles away. The reason he did not leave the ship and go overland to see them is clear enough. He had been warned that the hostility towards him in Ephesus had not diminished, and that his appearance would almost certainly provoke another riot. He sent a message asking them to come and meet him. His famous address to them, Acts 20, should be read by everyone who in any way wants to understand something of the nature of this fiery, indomitable little man. It is his farewell to Asia, and in it he declares that he knows that they will never meet again. I go in obedience to the Spirit of Jerusalem. Those words were certainly plain enough to his hearers. Stoned, scarred, lashed, scourged, the slave of God was deliberately going to his death. Somewhere on that walk to Assos, he had come to the conclusion that although he could probably stay in Asia or Greece for some years to come, he had to provoke the ultimate situation. The closing words of that master historian Luke are moving indeed. When Paul had finished, all of them kneeled down and prayed. Everyone was crying, and they hugged him and kissed him farewell. They grieved above all, because they knew that this was the last time they would ever see him. Then they went with him to the vessel. Paul has sometimes been portrayed, especially in Protestant circles, as an unattractive personality who corrupted Christianity. If one accepts the words of Nietzsche that there has only been one Christian, and he died on the cross, then there is perhaps some argument that Paul changed the message. At the same time, any study of his own writings or of Acts will reveal a man who, though he could arouse intense hatred among the Orthodox Jews, was both lovable and kind. From Miletus they went due south to Kos, borne always by that favorable northerly wind which cools the Aegean and gives all the area that astounding pencil-sharp clarity to be found nowhere else in the Mediterranean. Hippocrates, the father of medicine, had been born in Kos some 500 years before, and at the time that Paul passed the island, a Greek physician, Soranus, a native of Ephesus, was writing a biography of Hippocrates. Luke, if he had never been there, must have wanted to visit Kos, home of the man who had founded his healing profession. They passed it by and sailed on, leaving Rhodes on their starboard hand. It is curious, perhaps, that Paul never went to Rhodes, for the island sailors were the backbone of the imperial navy, and it was a busy and prosperous commercial port. If they sailed close to the city, he would have seen the ruins of yet another of the wonders of the world, the 100-feet-high Colossus of Rhodes, the bronze image of the sun god Apollo. It had stood at the entrance to the harbor until thrown down in an earthquake about 200 years before Paul and his companions came this way. They now headed west to Patara on the Asia Minor coast, one of the most important cities of Lycia, and the center of a cult of Apollo. Here they transshipped from their coaster into a merchantman, which was carrying a cargo down to Phoenicia. It was quite a long sea voyage this time, some 400 miles over that beautiful summer sea, the dolphins leaping in the hushing rustle of the bow wave. Then they sighted Cyprus to port of them, and the shining temple of Aphrodite above the harbor of Paphos. Paul must have wondered what had become of that false prophet, Bar-Jesus, and whether Sergius Paulus was still proconsul, and whether he had remained true to his conversion. Then it was the open sea again, until, after a run of about 24 hours, they sighted the bustling harbor and city of Tyre ahead of them. It is a tribute to their knowledge of winds and weather and the stars at night that the sea captains of those days could so regularly make their landfalls, and could conduct a steady transport of merchandise all over this sea. Few modern sailors would care to take a vessel from Patara to Tyre without a compass, After a week in Tyre, where he stayed with the local Christian community, waiting for the vessel to unload and take aboard Tyrian exports, Paul was on his way again. But before he left, they implored that, whatever he did, he would not go to Jerusalem. He had made up his mind on that. Even the sight of all these believers, together with their wives and children, kneeling and praying on the beach, though it moved his heart as he knelt with them, could not break his inflexible resolve. From Tyre, the ship sailed the few miles down the coast, called in for a day at Ptolemais, and then ran down to Caesarea. They were nearing the end of the journey. Paul's carefully chosen and deliberately set course was bringing him to the point of departure that he had long desired. 34. The inevitable. It was not necessary to be a prophet or a soothsayer to foresee what Paul's intended visit to Jerusalem would mean. In Caesarea, he stayed in the house of Philip the evangelist and his 4 unmarried daughters. They warned him not to proceed any further. This was reinforced when Agabus, the same man who had secured Paul's services years ago to take the famine relief to Jerusalem, came down to the city and implored him not to go. Agabus was well known as a prophet. In a symbolic gesture, he took the cord of Paul's cloak, knelt at his feet, and swiftly tied up Paul's feet and wrists with it. In the words of the Holy Spirit, he said, "The owner of this girdle will be tied in just such a way by the Jews in Jerusalem, and handed over to the Gentiles." Paul had known this all along, and the reference to the Gentiles meant, of course, the Roman authorities. This was exactly what he hoped for, and for no other reason would he have come back. At the same time, he must have been well aware that he might suffer the same fate as Stephen had done. He had been stoned before, but this time it would certainly prove fatal, in which case he would expiate his acquiescence in Stephen's death. If, on the other hand, he was protected by the Roman authorities, he would ultimately find his way to Rome. When they heard the words of Agabus, everyone implored Paul not to go. His reply indicated his resolve. "What do you mean by crying like this and breaking my heart? I am prepared not only to be bound, but even to die in Jerusalem for the sake of the Lord Jesus." He and his party now set off on muleback, taking the contributions from Caesarea for the Mother Church's relief fund. Apart from money, this no doubt included grain, dried fruits, and salted fish, the latter a staple part of diet for the poor. They stayed a night en route at the house of a Cypriot convert, and then pressed on up the winding road, which at this time of the year would have been crowded with pilgrims. The feast of Pentecost was due in a few days' time, and Paul was determined to be there for it. The curious fact is that Pentecost, which in the year 57 fell on 28 May, corresponded to an agricultural feast of Canaanite origin. It was celebrated 50 days after the Passover, and is described as the Feast of Harvest, being held 7 weeks after the beginning of the corn harvest. Apart from appropriate offerings being made in the temple in thanks for the harvest home, it was a time when the wine went round in no uncertain manner. As the Romans knew well, it was during this festival period that they might always expect trouble. Paul's first objective was to see James and the elders of the church, and to hand over the money for the general relief fund. He was well received and was encouraged to tell them all about his work in Asia, Macedonia, and Greece. They were, of course, delighted at the success that had accompanied this extraordinary missionary, who had been to so many places that they would never see, and who had managed to establish so many groups of believers so far afield. At the same time there were reservations. To judge from his account, wherever he had been, there had been trouble, and they remembered his previous record only too well. The church in Jerusalem had been quietly flourishing, and they had managed to reach a kind of modus vivendi with Orthodox Judaism. They urged Paul to go to the temple with 4 other men who had taken a vow to go through the ceremony of purification. This entailed abstaining from wine for 7 days, shaving the head, and at the end of the period, offering up a formal sacrifice. In this way, they felt the Orthodox Jews would accept the fact that Paul still followed the law, and that reports about him, which had filtered back that he had taught Gentiles and Jews things which were contrary to the law, would be discredited. Their intention was good and sensible, but in the heady atmosphere that always prevailed during the feast period, it was unlikely to succeed. Shortly before the 7 days were up, Paul was seen in the temple by some Jews from Asia, who instantly recognized him. Here was the fellow who had caused trouble wherever he went. He had polluted their communities from Antioch to Lystra to Derbe, all over the place, even as far afield as Macedonia and Greece. They had also seen him in Jerusalem, in the company of a Greek called Trophimus, and they assumed that he had even contradicted God's law by taking him into the temple. This was most unlikely, for Paul knew as well as anyone that no Gentile might pass that barrier. He was dragged out of the temple, the authorities in charge wisely closing the gates after him. At once, mass hysteria swept the city. The people were doing their best to kill Paul. The commander of the Roman garrison was immediately informed that Jerusalem was in a state of riot. Just the kind of thing he had expected. These Jews, outwardly so formal, so pompous, so smug. But let them get a few jars of wine under their belts, and they were worse than any other race in the empire. The riot squad was immediately summoned. They came at the double, sweeping the crowd aside with the butts of their spears, smashing them back with their shields. No doubt they wished in their hearts that they were in some quiet corner of the empire, where the girls were more easily available, the wine better, and the people more tractable. Once again, Paul owed his life to the long arm of Rome. The man who was actively bent on disseminating a revolutionary doctrine throughout the territories administered by Rome owed his life on many more than one occasion to the laws of the empire and to the Roman guardians of the peace. One is inevitably reminded of the lives of many agitators and revolutionaries in the British Empire. Their own peoples would often have killed them, if it had not been for the protective hand of the very power that they were seeking to overthrow. Followed by the screaming mob, Paul was hustled away by the legionaries up to the fortress Antonia, overlooking the temple and dominating all the city. The commander, Claudius Lysias, another man who no doubt wished that he had had a different appointment, had Paul arrested and chained. He then demanded of the ringleaders of the screaming crowd what charge they laid against this savaged and beaten man. Some were shouting one thing and some another, so that he could not understand what definite charge was preferred. He had Paul carried up to the garrison, while the mob continued to shout out, "Kill him! Kill him!" As he was being taken into the fort, Paul said to the commander in Greek, "May I have a word with you?" The Roman recognized at once that this was an educated man, not some sneak thief or ignorant peasant. "You speak Greek, then?" he asked with some surprise. "Then you certainly aren't that Egyptian fellow who led some 4,000 men out into the desert, terrorists, and started a revolution." He was referring to a comparatively recent occasion when there had been yet another of the practically perennial uprisings in the country, and the procurator Felix had been forced to take action and kill most of them. "I am not," said Paul. "I am a Jew, a citizen of Tarsus in Cilicia. May I please speak to these people?" The Roman, wisely recognizing that the best way out of all this brouhaha was to let the prisoner address his own race, in the course of which he might possibly learn what the devil all the trouble was about, gave him the necessary permission. Shielded by the legionaries, standing on the steps of the great fortress, Paul, with that characteristic gesture, motioned with his hand to the people. It is significant of his amazing personality that they fell silent to listen to a man whom a few minutes before they had been trying to tear to pieces. He spoke in Aramaic. This was proof enough that he was really a Jew, for what Greek or Roman had ever really learned to master the intricacies of their language. He was not a foreigner then, but one who, whatever might have been said against him, belonged to their own blood. That fact won their silence and even their potential approval. Paul went on to recount his Tarsian birth, the fact that he had been a student under Gamaliel, and that he had received strict instruction as to the law. He told them how he had persecuted what he had then considered this dissident sect of Christ believers in Damascus, and how he had been struck down on the way. He had been convinced that Jesus was indeed the true Messiah, the one so long promised, and that he, Paul, had a special mission to take this message to the Gentiles. That was enough. They had listened to him with attention and interest before, but here he was proclaiming that their special Jewish Messiah was for the Gentiles as well. Intolerable. Their fury mounted, they raved and screamed, and the still somewhat baffled Roman commander ordered the guard to take Paul into the fortress. This was not only to protect him from the people, but to find out exactly what he was saying that had provoked this riot, the last thing he, like any garrison commander, wanted on his hands. Torture was as widely used in the Roman world as it still is today to elicit information. It was slightly more primitive, though. There were no electric contacts to apply to the genitals, for instance, but it was still extremely efficient. Paul was taken to the whipping post, his shabby cloak stripped from him, and the lash was about to be applied. Over the years, he had had enough of physical suffering, nearly always administered by his own race. He was, after all, a man now in his middle 50s. He appealed to the lieutenant in charge. "I am a Roman citizen. Have you any right to whip a citizen who has not even been charged with any crime?" The reaction was immediate. Panic. True citizenship was so valuable and rare that most probably the lieutenant, and few if any of the soldiers, were citizens. Word was immediately sent to Lysias that this Jew, whom they had been about to lash, was a civis Romanus. Nobody can possibly improve on the account in Acts. The commander went to Paul and said, "Is it true that you are a Roman citizen?" "Yes," was the answer. Claudius Lysias no doubt looked at this beaten-up aging Jew with blood on his body, and every sign that he had been in many a brawl before, with some astonishment. Roman citizens, after all, were the rulers of the world, and there were few enough of them. He himself, after a distinguished military career, had managed to buy himself citizenship. But this man, whom he had been on the point of having whipped, had been, if he was to believe his words, born a citizen. Paul, as has been said before, no doubt had some documentary evidence, somewhat similar to a modern passport, which proved his status. The man was clearly highly educated, could speak Latin, Greek, and this cursed Aramaic. Until his statement was proved, it was clearly unwise to treat him as if he was just another of these troublesome colonials, who were always making some kind of fracas about their religion. Lysias had him freed at once, but in ordinary consideration of military security, kept him confined to barracks. The conclusion he came to, logically enough, was to allow him to meet his accusers the following morning. It was clearly, as far as he could see, not a political matter that infringed the laws of Rome. It was something to do with their infernal religion. 35. The Imprisoned Man. The confrontation next day between Paul and the assembled council of the Sanhedrin is one of the most dramatic events in history. Here he was at last then, the man who had done his utmost to overthrow their authority, and who seemed also to be trying to overthrow the Roman Empire. It was true enough that they hated being under foreign rule and treated as second-class citizens in their own land, but that had happened to their ancestors before them. One thing, though, that they had always clung to was the inevitable rightness of their belief. They had very reluctantly, rather less than more, accepted this offshoot of Messiah believers headed by James the Just. It was difficult to fault James. He conformed impeccably to the law in every respect, and was as good a practicing Jew as anyone living. There was only one thing wrong with James. He maintained that his brother had been the Messiah predicted by all the prophets. But this man Saul, or Paulus, as he apparently preferred to call himself, this suspect Jew of Tarsus, probably a bastard of Roman stock for all they knew, he was something different altogether. Paul infuriated them at once by addressing them as brothers, whereas they should have been called elders of Israel. He then went on to say that he had lived a good life and had a clear conscience. A good life, a clear conscience. A man who had been spreading a corrupt version of the Jewish faith all over the world, living with Gentiles, probably eating the other thing, and for all they knew, fornicating with heathen women in terrible temples. The high priest, Ananias, very naturally ordered him to be struck on the mouth for blasphemy. Paul's reaction was to call the high priest a whitewashed wall for allowing him to be struck contrary to the law. This was a terrible insult. Whitewash was used for the outside of tombs, for the mud houses of the poor, and for privies. He was accused of insulting God's high priest, to which he replied that he did not know that he was the high priest. He added, in mock contrition, that he was well aware from the prophets that "Thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people." Paul certainly knew who the high priest was. He knew his name. He knew him from where he sat and from his robes. Once again, the revolutionary in his nature asserted itself. He then saw the chance to cause dissent among the members of the Sanhedrin. He was, of course, perfectly familiar with the bitter division that existed between the Pharisees and the Sadducees on the subject of resurrection from the dead. The Sadducees said that it did not exist. He now proclaimed himself a Pharisee, born of Pharisees, and that he believed in resurrection. Immediately tumult broke out, some shouting one thing and some another. The Roman commander, Lysias, who had brought Paul to the meeting, no doubt looked on with amused contempt. What could you do with such people? Here they all were, shouting and screaming and tearing at one another's beards over some purely abstract matter. In any case, every man knew that when you were dead, you were dead. He had seen enough of them in his life. He ordered his bodyguard to take Paul away before he got injured in the brawl. Paul was imprisoned once more in the great fortress of Antonia. The whole thing was beyond the comprehension of Lysias. After all, he was only a Chiliarch, the commander of 1,000 men. This matter seemed to have reached a stage when it must be referred to higher authorities. At this point, there was a very unexpected intervention. Paul's sister, whose name we do not even know, had married and settled in Jerusalem. Her son now came to Lysias and reported that he had heard of a plot to kill his uncle. It is almost certain that Paul's sister and her family were Orthodox Jews. Had they been Christians, it is highly unlikely that her son would have been allowed to listen in on such a dangerous conversation. No doubt they disliked Paul's views, but the closeness of Jewish family relationships was such that a threat against any member of the family was a threat against all. Blood was much thicker than water, or even differences of religious belief. Lysias, who must have been sick and tired of the whole matter, learned to his astonishment that over 40 Jews, probably zealots, and possibly temple police, whom the Sanhedrin occasionally used to do a little discreet killing, quite contrary to Roman law, had taken a vow to murder Paul. They had declared that they would neither eat nor drink until they had accomplished their mission. Paul's nephew was brave. He took his life in his hands by reporting such a matter to a Roman. Paul's nephew was brave. He took his life in his hands by reporting such a matter to a Roman. It is the first time that we hear either of him or his mother, but one must assume that in every respect there was a reconciliation, and that some part of the family patrimony must have been shortly afterwards handed over to Paul. In the latter phases of his life, there is no indication that he had to revert to his trade, or that he was ever desperately short of money. From his shipwreck journey on to his years in Rome, there is no mention of tent-making or of poverty. It is almost equally certain that some of the churches which he had founded sent some part of their poor relief donations to this man who had brought them the news about the Messiah and about the imminent end of the world. Lysias, in any case, wanted this man out of the city. Whether he was right, or whether he was wrong, or whether all the Jews were mad, as he sometimes suspected, it was his duty to remove a troublemaker from a city that was fiery enough at the best of times. He wrote immediately to the procurator of Judea, telling him that a Roman citizen by birth, though a Jew by blood, had been seized by the Jews in Jerusalem, who were screaming for him to be killed. It would appear in his view that this man Paulus had done nothing to contravene the laws of Rome. He thought, however, that for his protection it would be best to send him down to Caesarea with an escort, for there was a plot to murder him. Felix, the procurator, must have received the news with melancholy resignation. Caesarea was pleasant enough in itself. His palace was extremely comfortable. The wine was drinkable, especially the imported Cyprus. But he was aware of the misfortune that had attended some of his predecessors. How much pleasanter it would have been to have been posted to Greece, to France, anywhere but Judea. In due course, Paul arrived at Caesarea, and was put in one of the dungeons of the palace that Herod the Great had built. Roman citizen or not, he must be securely locked up until Felix had heard exactly what were the charges preferred against him. 5 days later, the high priest Ananias and some elders of the Sanhedrin came down from Jerusalem to see the procurator. Intelligently enough, they had taken the trouble to bring a Roman lawyer named Tertullus with them. He could speak in the kind of rhetorical way that these Romans understood. They themselves could only talk about the law and contraventions of their faith. These things, they knew perfectly well, were quite beyond the understanding of pagan Gentiles. Tertullus began in the usual manner by saying how wise the procurator had been, and how well he had administered the area. He added that he did not want to take up too much of a busy man's time, but the fact was that the accused was a menace to society. Everywhere he went there was a riot. Felix, who had been born a slave, and had risen to his high position through his brother having been one of the Emperor Claudius's favorite freedmen, did not want trouble any more than Lysias did. He heard from this Roman lawyer that Lysias had removed Paul with great violence, quite untrue, from the hands of the Sanhedrin. Paul's reply was logical, and absolutely in character. He had done nothing to contravene the Roman laws. His only argument had been with the Jews, because he had said that he believed in the resurrection of the dead. Felix must have sighed. His wife was a Jewess. He had heard about all this dispute between the Pharisees and Sadducees. It seemed to him unimportant. He had a territory to administer for the Emperor Nero, and it had to be administered under the laws of Rome. He dismissed the case. But at the same time, he gave orders that the prisoner, who had caused all this disturbance, should be held in custody until further notice. Paul was well treated, allowed to receive friends, and to have his own food brought to him from outside. More than that, Felix and his wife Drusilla had this strange character brought up to them, and listened to his opinions concerning this man whom he maintained was the Savior of the human race, and not just the promised Messiah of the Jews. Drusilla's position was a curious one. She was the third wife of Felix, and as a Jewess, should never have married a Gentile. It is more than possible that the interest shown in Paul's teachings stemmed from a feeling on her part that she should expiate her sins. She had, after all, previously been married to the king of Commagena, whom she had divorced in order to marry a Roman. This certainly made her, in Jewish eyes, an adulteress. Felix, for his part, was a self-indulgent and rather lax administrator. He was in due course to be summoned back to Rome for an inquiry about a riot that broke out in Caesarea between the Jewish and Greek inhabitants of the city. Also, according to Acts, he hoped that this prisoner Paulus might give him a bribe in order to secure his release. Most Roman governors sent to distant parts of the empire expected that in return for their services to the state, they would make themselves a small or even a very large private fortune. Paul was not interested. He must have known well enough that for a sum of money he could be released. He also knew that once outside the safety of the palace prison, the Jews would kill him. He saw his friends, he wrote his letters, he kept in touch with the communities, so why should he venture out? Paul stayed in prison in Caesarea for close on 2 years. Then in 59, when Felix was recalled to Rome, the new procurator, Porcius Festus, had to consider, among all his other problems, the one of this unusual prisoner. After landing at Caesarea and being formally installed in his office, Festus left after 3 days to visit Jerusalem. That city, after all, was his principal charge, and as he knew from the records, the place where any trouble inevitably originated. It was his duty also to meet the Sanhedrin formally, and hear their opinions about the state of things in Judea. He heard soon enough about the prisoner in his palace. He was apparently a revolutionary who had broken all the laws, those of Rome and those of the Jews. Festus was well briefed, and he was no man's fool. He suspected at once, when these elderly Jews asked for the prisoner to be brought up to Jerusalem to stand trial, that an attempt would be made to murder him, either on the way or in the city itself. He insisted that the accusers should themselves come down to Caesarea and put their case before him, where he would ensure that dispassionate justice would be administered. The result was exactly as Paul had long ago foreseen. The charges that he had done anything wrong against Jewish law, or the temple, or the emperor of Rome did not hold water. Apparently, he believed in some dead man, whom he maintained was still alive, and that this man was the Savior of the world. He believed also that the world was soon to come to an end. To Festus, all this meant very little. The world ended every minute of every day for someone or other. Men, women, and children, they were dying all the time. Death was the only certainty. All Romans knew that. As a Roman citizen, Paul knew his rights, just as well as the proconsul did. When asked if he was willing to go and stand trial in Jerusalem, he said no. He knew well enough that no trial there would be unbiased, if he ever arrived alive. He took the ultimate step. I appeal unto Caesar. This was something that Festus certainly could not deny him. Paul's voyage to Rome was assured. 36. Where two seas met. A few days after Paul had been granted the right of appeal to Caesar, which could not be denied him, the puppet king of Judea, Herod Agrippa II, arrived in Caesarea to pay his first official call on the new proconsul. He arrived in company with his sister Bernice, with whom he was living in incest. A man who owed his position to the Romans, and who was later to assist them in the capture of Jerusalem in the great siege of A.D. 70. He was one of those Jews who had become almost more Roman than the Romans. Other and later colonial societies have witnessed many similar cases. Festus, who was naturally preoccupied by the problems raised by his Jewish prisoner, asked this 32-year-old son of Agrippa I if he would care to help him over this peculiar case. This king was Romanized, but he was, after all, still a Jew, and ought to be able to enlighten Festus on some of the points of their law. As far as he could see, the prisoner had done nothing that contravened Roman law, and the Jews who had come down from the Sanhedrin had been unable to convince him that he had done anything contrary to their own. Paul was brought in next day before the incestuous royals, Procurator Festus, and an assembled crowd of local notables. He was chained to a soldier. He was not known as a man of violence, but only as a man who was constantly the victim of violence. In any case, he was a prisoner, and the chain was symbolic more than anything else. It was a very formal occasion. The new procurator, the king and his sister queen, the Roman soldiers, and the slaves waving peacock feather fans over the assembled company. They had come to hear the opinions of a strange, balding, gray-bearded Jew about some event which he insisted had occurred within their lifetimes. There can be small doubt that Luke himself was present, for the record in Acts is so vivid that only an eyewitness could have written it. If it was not Luke, then it was a reporter of great brilliance. Rather than recapitulate the whole scene, it is better to refer to Acts 25 through 27. He would be a daring man who would attempt to challenge the brevity and authority of that writer. In brief, Felix put before the assembled company the charges that had been laid against Paul, explaining also that when he had asked Paul if he was willing to go to Jerusalem, the latter had appealed to the emperor. He himself, he said, could not find that the man had done any wrong or any harm against either the Jews or the empire. Agrippa now said to Paul, "You have our permission to speak on your own behalf." Paul made a characteristic gesture. He stretched out his hand. He then recounted the whole of his history. Born a Pharisee, became a persecutor of Christians, then had his extraordinary vision on the road to Damascus. Since that moment, he had devoted his whole life to setting up communities throughout Asia and Greece, where both Jews and Gentiles had adopted the belief that a man called Joshua had indeed been not only the chosen of God, but the Son of God. The world was soon to come to an end, at any rate, the material world of the Roman Empire, and then another kingdom would ensue, the one so long promised by the prophets of Israel. It would be the physical resurrection of this Messiah that became too much for the Romans. Festus shouted out, "Paulus, you are mad." He accepted the fact of Paul's considerable intelligence and knowledge of the Jewish prophets, but added the corollary, "Too much learning has driven you insane." Bernice was uninterested, Agrippa was bored, and Festus, for his part, was infuriated with these maniacs he had been sent to govern. He had a couple next to him, to whom he had to pay token respect. And he had this ragged cloaked lunatic raving on about a crucified criminal who had apparently fulfilled all the prophets of the ancient Jews, which automatically made him the savior of all mankind. On the other hand, there was absolutely no reason why he should be jailed. Both Agrippa and his sister wife agreed that he had broken no Jewish law, and he certainly had broken no Roman one. He could go free. But the trouble was that he had asserted his rights and appealed to Caesar. Agrippa remarked when he left the hall, "This man could certainly have been released if he had not appealed to the emperor." It was in this way that Paul, accompanied by Luke and Aristarchus, a Greek convert from Thessalonica, were dispatched on their way under the covering arm of Rome, in the shape of the Lieutenant Julius. Their voyage, which started from Myra, was to end in the most famous shipwreck in history on the island of Malta, or Melita, as it was called by the Greeks, meaning honey. The small island then as now was noted for the quality of the honey which its black bees made from the innumerable herbs that grew on its rocky slopes. It was round about midnight on the 14th day of the Gregali that had driven them across the Mediterranean from Crete, that the lookouts on the bows heard the sound of breakers ahead. They took a sound with a deep-sea lead, and found that it was rapidly shallowing, first about 120 feet, and then shortly afterwards only 90. Quite apart from this tangible evidence, they knew by their sailor's instinct that they were rapidly approaching a shore. They could hear the boom and sizzle ahead of them, and although the night still seems to have been dark and cloudy, they could probably descry the outline of the coast. There has been endless controversy about the exact site of this shipwreck, and for a time even the island of Meleda in the Adriatic was canvassed as the place where Paul came ashore. There can be absolutely no doubt that this was a complete misconception, and later papal pronouncements that it was undoubtedly the island of Malta are hardly necessary. I quote from a distinguished meteorological officer who formerly worked in Malta. The sequence of meteorological events encountered by St. Paul after leaving Fair Havens is consistent with an eastward-moving depression passing to the south of Crete. Southerly winds ahead of the depression would back to east or northeast, and a strong northerly flow would be triggered down the Aegean. Winds funneling down the Cretan ravines and through the Kythera Channel would probably increase the natural wind speed. Persistent strong winds from between east and north are normal in this area after the passage of a low. The ship would thus be driven well to the west-southwest of Crete, into the open sea, much as Ulysses was in the same general area centuries before. The traditional site of the wreck is still called St. Paul's Bay. It is usually unwise to query tradition. Words transmitted for generation after generation by a simple people, who have little or no knowledge of books, are often completely accurate. For instance, it took the genius of Heinrich Schliemann, acting solely on the basis of the Homeric poems and local legend, to find the city of Troy in the very place where all early accounts had said that it was. The only thing that can raise any controversy as to the site of Paul's shipwreck is Luke's very clear words that the ship came to a place where two seas met, Tropon, Diathalason. The bay concerned, and the island on which a statue of Paul has been erected, can hardly be called a place where two seas met. There are few of such in the whole Mediterranean. One is the Bosporus, where the Black Sea runs into the Mediterranean. Another is at the Strait of Gibraltar. Another is the Messina Strait, where the Ionian and the Tyrrhenian seas meet. Yet another is the Bonifacio Strait, between Corsica and Sardinia. In the small Maltese archipelago, there is only one other place where two seas meet, and that is in the channel between Malta itself and its sister island Gozo to the north. At this point, the eastern Mediterranean does indeed meet the western. Homer rightly called Malta the navel of the sea, and such it is, being almost equidistant between Cyprus to the east, Gibraltar to the west, and roughly halfway between Italy and North Africa. One might opt for the northeasternmost point of Malta, called Larax, fierce, cruel, rough and uneven, for at this point the two seas meet. In any case, the exact location is relatively unimportant, some scholars having argued for one place and some for another. In the final analysis, it is perhaps better to stick to tradition. Recent archaeological investigations have disclosed that the villa of an important Roman official, possibly Publius, the chief magistrate of the island, was at a place long called St. Paul Milki, St. Paul welcomed. This is comparatively close to the traditional site of the shipwreck, and there is interesting evidence that a very early Christian church was built on the site of the villa. Furthermore, graffiti depicting a bearded man with the inscription Paul below in Greek letters, as well as what appears to be a shipwreck scene, would seem to confirm what the Maltese themselves have long believed. As the ship drew in on that dark November night towards the rocks, they lowered 4 anchors from the stern and prayed for the daylight. Some have found it strange that they should have dropped the anchors from the stern. There is no room for any confusion here. Ships of this period always carried a number of anchors both fore and aft, usually with stalks of wood and flukes of iron or lead. In some ports, the ships came into the jetty bows on, thus necessitating stern anchors. Today in the Mediterranean, it is customary for sailing vessels to lie stern to, that is, dropping an anchor or anchors from the bow, and then backing up to the quay or jetty. But practically all modern sailing yachts or small cargo boats have engines, which means that this operation is not too difficult. In the times when Paul was sailing about this sea, it was always necessary for a ship to be able to anchor either bows on or stern to. In any case, the master of the ship was eminently practical. He was driving onto the rocks of some unknown shore with a strong wind and following sea behind him. Had he dropped his forward anchors, the ship would inevitably have swung around, and her stern would have struck. The sailors now attempted to abandon ship, and began lowering the longboat, the same which they had hoisted aboard off the island of Clauda. Paul, practical as ever, spotted what they were up to, and pointed out to Julius that if the sailors went, the ship was certainly doomed. The passengers were all seasick and terrified, and in any case did not know the trade of the sea, and their only hope of salvation was to see that the professionals remained aboard. Julius gave the necessary orders to his soldiers. They cut the rope, securing the longboat, and let it wash ashore. St. Paul's Bay can be a terrifying place when the Gregale blows, for although a good anchorage in summer, it is wide open to the northeast. Only a few years ago, dozens of yachts, some of considerable size, were wrecked here under just such conditions as Luke describes. Paul, again showing that common sense which never deserted him, and fully aware that they would all probably have to swim ashore, urged everyone to eat some bread. Acts can hardly be accurate in making him say that for the whole 14 days none of them had eaten a thing. They would not have survived. The expression is metaphorical. The bread must have been old and wet, for the galley fire would have been doused many days before. But at least it was some form of sustenance for the ordeal that lay ahead of them. After everyone had eaten something, they set to, along with the sailors, and threw the rest of the wheat cargo into the sea. The captain of the ship, if he was also the owner, must have been in a very sad frame of mind. He had lost the whole cargo with which he had been hoping to catch the winter wheat market, and the high prices that then prevailed in Italy. Now he was about to lose his ship as well. When dawn broke, they saw that they were just off a bay with a beach. This does indeed sound like the traditional site of the wreck. So they cut the hawsers to their stern anchors, let go the 2 big steering paddles, and hoisted the small foresail. There was nothing else for them to do, with the Gregale still blowing, but to run the ship aground. From the shore, the Maltese villagers watched them. They would have been fishermen mostly, and it is quite certain that this would not have been the first merchantman that they had seen swept upon their shore. Malta is an ideal sailing area for about 8 months of the year, but in the late autumn or winter, if a northeaster makes up, it presents its hard limestone rocks to the unlucky visitor. Acts says that the bows hit a sandbank and got stuck. It was equally probably a rock shoal, such as are common on the east coast of the island. At any rate, the bows were held fast, while the thundering swell behind them was gradually pounding the stern to pieces. Looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, if their stern anchors were holding, they would have been better to have stayed where they were and sit it out. But they had been under extremely unusual conditions of bad weather for a fortnight. Gregales usually do not last much more than 4 days, and the sight of land proved too much for the captain and the crew. Comparatively few ships are lost at sea. It is the land that destroys them, as the evidence of ancient wrecks all round the Mediterranean littoral testify. At this point, as the ship was breaking up, the military escort decided that it would be better to kill the prisoners under their charge than give them the opportunity of escaping. This was natural enough, for to lose a prisoner meant forfeiting your life. Julius, their commander, intervened. It is clear that he had become fascinated with Paul's character, possibly even with the doctrine that he preached. He could not make an exception just for one prisoner, so he ordered that none of them were to be harmed. Those passengers who could swim, he ordered to jump overboard and make for the shore first. The rest would follow on planks, or pieces of the ship's broken timbers. There was no loss of life, and all reached the shore safely. It was exactly as Paul had forecast. They would be wrecked on an island, but everyone would be saved. 37. Winter and Spring. The friendly islanders welcomed them, and they learned that the island was called Melita. Some of the people possibly spoke a version of Demotic Greek, but most of them spoke a Semitic tongue, derived from their occupation in earlier centuries by the Phoenicians. The Maltese had already started to gather sticks and brushwood together, and had got a fire going even before the salt-stained survivors from the wreck reached the shore. The natives there were very friendly to us. They still are to this day, hospitality being a very noticeable characteristic of their race. Paul, undaunted as ever, was one of the first to start helping with gathering sticks for the fire. It was at this point that the famous episode with the snake occurred. As he was about to throw on his contribution, a snake, which had no doubt been hibernating in the brushwood, jumped out and fastened on his hand. When the Maltese saw the snake hanging from his hand, they assumed that he must be a murderer, a man whom their god or goddess had allowed to escape from the sea, but would not allow to escape from justice. Paul merely shook it off into the fire. They expected him to die, but when he carried on quite normally, they decided that he must be a god. His reputation was established from the very beginning. The fact of the matter is that the snake was almost certainly not poisonous. To quote the Encyclopedia Britannica on the subject of the fauna of Malta, there are 4 species of lizard and 3 non-venomous snakes. The legend in the island to this day is that Paul removed the venom from all the snakes there, just as St. Patrick is credited with having done in Ireland some 4 centuries later. Occasionally, but only rarely, a poisonous snake may be met with in Malta, despite the encyclopedia's dictum, but these have probably come in on cargo boats from other countries such as Libya. F.A. Spencer in Beyond Damascus quotes the interesting fact that, "To this day, in southern Italy, there are persons called Sanapolari, who by virtue of being born on St. Paul's night, 24th to 25th of January, can, according to popular belief, kill poisonous beasts with their spittle." One unusual thing emerges from any consideration of Paul's stay in Malta. Luke takes a disparaging view of these kindly people and calls them barbarians. This was because he was a Greek. The term in his language for non-Greek speakers had long been, indeed since the days of Homer, barbaroi, people who went bar, and were not civilized enough to speak Greek. Paul, on the other hand, quite apart from his friendship with Publius, the headman or chief magistrate of the islands, had the considerable advantage over his 2 Greek companions of being able to speak Aramaic. Now the Punic dialect the islanders spoke had descended from the same roots as Hebrew, and there can be little doubt that Paul would have been able to communicate with them in their own tongue comparatively easily. To this day, indeed, Maltese who visit Syria and Lebanon, homes of their distant ancestors, do not find it so difficult to do the same. This might well account for the success of Paul's winter months in Malta, where it would seem certain that he left behind the nucleus of a flourishing church. Publius is traditionally credited with having been the first bishop or elder of the church in Malta. The principal cause of Paul's success was that he managed to heal Publius's father, who had fever and dysentery, by the traditional laying on of hands. Again, there can be little doubt that the all-important element of faith and belief came into play. Here came a man who could speak not only Latin and Greek, but even a version of the Maltese tongue. He had been wrecked and saved, bitten by a snake and taken no harm. All the elements requisite to implicit trust were present. Julius, Paul, and his 2 attendants stayed 3 days in the house of the chief magistrate, and then left, no doubt, to rent a room in the capital city, which was sited on a rocky ridge almost in the center of the island. It is very unlikely, contrary to local tradition, that Paul was imprisoned in a cave or dungeon. Julius by now had come to trust his prisoner completely, and, in any case, It was Paul who, of his own volition, was taking his case to the Emperor of Rome. No doubt, the other unfortunate convicted criminals were so immured, which must have been very unpleasant for them. The winters in the island, although not very cold, can be extremely windy and damp. But from the viewpoint of Julius, they were expendable. They were probably going to be expended in any case in the arena. And the only thing that he had to see to was that they did not escape. And a small island, only 18 miles long by 9 wide, was prison enough in itself, once the sailing season had closed and no ships were available. If any of them had escaped by boat, they could not have got any further than the even smaller sister island of Gozo, where they would have been still more marooned. Luke records that after the sensational recovery of Publius's father, numerous islanders came to Paul and were healed. One may possibly suspect that some of Luke's medical knowledge came into all this. He records that they gave us many gifts. Some of the low-lying areas of Malta would certainly have been malarial, and indeed have been so right into the 20th century, until brought under control by modern science. Luke is very brief about the winter in Malta, no doubt, for the reason given above, that he could not speak the language. He concludes his account with the words, "After 2 months, we sailed off on a ship from Alexandria called the Twin Gods, which had been wintering in the island." A ship from Alexandria was certainly a grain ship, which had probably been lying in that great limestone cleft in Malta's eastern side, which is now known as Grand Harbor. The Twin Gods, under whose protection Paul and all the others sailed, were Castor and Pollux, sons of Zeus, to whom he awarded immortality by placing them in the sky as the constellation still known as Gemini, the twins. They had been wrecked in November, so as they were only in Malta for 3 months, they must have left before the official opening of the sailing season, probably in early February 62. Paul was now in his middle or even late 50s, a man who had suffered all things, but who had remained consistently faithful to his dream for many years. He had set up his network of communities throughout the Levant, Cyprus, Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. And now he had even added the island of Malta to his list. Rome lay ahead, and quite apart from the city itself, he was eager to see what remained of the Christians there, if any, after the Claudian expulsions. One of the reasons that the captain of the ship left so early was undoubtedly that he wanted to catch the grain market as early as possible, to get a high price just after the winter, and before the other big grain carriers began to move up from Alexandria. The other reason was that at this time of the year there are a great many southerly winds. Sicily, his next landfall, lay only 70 miles to the north. They passed Cape Passero, the southernmost cape of Sicily. Then, presumably, their favorable wind failed them, for they put into Syracuse for 3 days. It was there that the Athenian fleet had been destroyed during the Peloponnesian War over 4 centuries before, and the fate of the Athenian Empire had been sealed. Luke may have known this, but it is doubtful if old dead history meant anything to Paul. Once the greatest port in the central Mediterranean, indeed, one of the greatest cities ever created by the Greek genius, Syracuse was now no more than just another big commercial port in the communications network of the empire. When the wind shifted, they headed on up north, passing under the giant bulk of Mount Etna, which at this time of the year would have been covered with snow. It cannot have been warm in February, going up the Sicilian coast, but the travelers of those days were a hardy lot. They had to be. But in a large ship of this type, there would have been a good galley, hot soup and bread, and no doubt many of them would have brought fresh provisions with them. The ship called in at Rhegium, the city and port on the toe of Italy. Possibly some of the travelers had to disembark here, but it seems more than likely that the current which pours through the Messina Strait was against them. This strait connects the Ionian and Tyrrhenian seas, and twice daily the current reverses from north to south. The captain would have given a wide berth to the whirlpool Charybdis on the Sicilian side, not so fearsome to his large vessel as it had been to the open craft of Ulysses. And the monster Scylla no longer leaned from her rock on the Italian side to seize sailors from passing ships. The Romans had very largely tamed this sea, as far as any sea is tameable. They got a favorable southerly again, and were on their way up the coast of Italy, passing Capri, which Tiberius had made so infamous, that beautiful rocky island with its sweet vines, which would still have been in their winter sleep. They were now in the Bay of Naples, with the great mountainous peak of Vesuvius on their starboard hand. At the moment it was dormant, and the citizens of Stabiae, Herculaneum, and Pompeii, those resort towns which nestled at its feet, were happy in their marketplaces, their village bars and brothels, unsuspecting that the mountain was potentially active. 1 year later, in 63, the giant began to stir, and there was a severe earthquake which did considerable damage. Then it went to sleep again. Everyone forgot about it until on 24 August, 79, for the first recorded time, it exploded in that violent eruption which destroyed all the towns in the area. No doubt, if Paul had known the manners and mores of the Pompeians and others, he would have said that it was the just judgment of God. But by then he had been dead for 15 years. On their starboard bow there now lay the city of Neapolis, gleaming white in the sun, one of the earliest Greek settlements in this area, and long a great center of culture and commerce. Neapolis, the modern Naples, now disfigured by high-rise buildings and international architectural substandardization, was at that time one of the pearls of the Tyrrhenian Sea. Its wonderful scenery and luxurious life had long attracted Roman residents, although it still remained basically a Greek city. Paul's ship was not bound for it, however. The excellent harbor of Puteoli, which lay some miles to the west, was the principal emporium for the Alexandrian grain trade. The town had a better harbor than that of Neapolis, partly resulting from the extravagance of Caligula, whose floating bridge of boats, extending as far as the spa of Baiae, had in part been extended into the mole, behind which all the merchantmen were berthed. The whole place was a seething cosmopolitan hodgepodge from all over the empire. There were traders and sailors from every nation, mountebanks, flute players, bar keepers, and whores, everything that can be found in a great international port. Paul was nearing the end of his journey, of all his journeys. 38. The final chapter. A Roman End. Paul was permitted by his escorting officer Julius to spend a week in a private house in Puteoli. The latter no doubt had a number of official tasks to execute, such as getting his condemned prisoners on the road to Rome. Probably, like any soldier, he also wanted some days and nights ashore in a cheerful place where there was plenty of entertainment. He knew in any case that Paul would not, as it were, desert. Paul himself was undoubtedly highly encouraged to find that there was a small Christian community already established in Puteoli. He heard about a similar one thriving in Rome. Messages were sent ahead to tell the members to expect the imminent arrival of the man who had done more than almost anyone else to promote their cause. Clearly, the Claudian expulsions had not proved entirely effective, or had been rescinded by Nero, or, which is far more likely, had just been allowed to lapse. A change of emperor in Rome was somewhat similar to a change of government in a modern state. The previous administration was almost invariably discredited. A new set of administrators took over, and many previous edicts were abolished, or quietly forgotten. From Puteoli, Paul, his 2 friends, and his escort made their way up to Formia, an ancient town from which the great Appian Way marched all of 40 miles to Rome. Many Roman nobles had their villas near Formia, for the area produced good wine, and the climate was considerably better than that of Rome in midsummer. Paul at last was nearing his destination, the one for which he had fought so hard over so many years. He was nearing the heart of the matter, the place from which one man alone, the emperor, proclaimed that he was God. What did Rome mean to Paul? It was certainly the largest city he had ever seen. It made Tarsus, Jerusalem, Corinth, and even Athens look provincial. Its population at that time was over 1 million Roman citizens, and probably about the same number of slaves. It was the same Rome which the great satirist Juvenal was to write about not very many years after Paul's death. The wagons thundering past, through those narrow twisting streets, the oaths of draymen caught in a traffic jam. If a business appointment summons the tycoon, he gets there fast by litter, tacking above the crowd. There's plenty of room inside. He can read, or take notes, or snooze as he jogs along. Those drawn blinds are most soporific. Even so he outstrips us. However fast we pedestrians hurry, we're blocked by the crowds ahead, while those behind us tread on our heels. Sharp elbows buffet my ribs. Poles poke into me. One lout swings a crossbeam down on my skull. Another scores with a barrel. My legs are mud-encrusted. Big feet kick me. A hobnailed soldier's boot lands squarely on my toe. Do you see all that steam and bustle? The great man's hangers-on are getting their free dinner, each with his own kitchen boy in attendance. Those outsized dixies, and all the rest of the gear, one poor little slave must balance on his head while he trots along to keep the charcoal glowing, would tax the strength of a muscle-bound general. Here's the great trunk of a fir tree swaying along on its wagon. And look, another dray behind it, stacked high with pine logs, a nodding threat over the heads of the crowd. Translated by Peter Green. This was the world that Paul was to get to know during the year that he spent in Rome awaiting trial. Undoubtedly, he lived in his own quarters, part of a tenement rented and paid for by himself and his supporters. It was possibly in the vicinity of a barracks, for day and night a soldier on duty would have been chained to him. It was from here that he wrote some of those magnificent letters to the Philippians, the Ephesians, Colossians, to Philemon, Titus, and Timothy, and doubtless others which have since been lost. Rome stimulated him, and how could it not? At long last, after years of travel and constant ill health and much physical ill-treatment, he had reached the seat of power. He talked with the Christians, he talked with the Jews, he talked with anyone who would come and listen to him. He established in Rome a center of believers that, despite all the later submergence of the Roman Empire, would never die. Acts concludes with the words, "For 2 years, Paul lived there in a place that he rented himself. He welcomed all who came to see him. He told them about the kingdom of God and about the Lord Jesus Christ, speaking with complete boldness and freedom." Acts concludes with the words, "For 2 years, Paul lived there in a place that he rented himself. He welcomed all who came to see him. He told them about the kingdom of God and about the Lord Jesus Christ, speaking with complete boldness and freedom." It is evidence of Roman liberalism that even under the reign of Nero, he was allowed such liberty of speech. Paul was also to get to know the Rome described so brilliantly by J.W. McHale centuries later. The drip of water from the aqueduct that passed over the gate, from which the dusty, squalid Appian Way stretched its long suburb. The garret under the tiles, where, just as now, the pigeons sleeked themselves in the sun, and the rain drummed on the roof. The narrow, crowded streets, half choked with the builders' carts, and the pavements ringing under the heavy military boots of guardsmen. The tavern waiters trotting along with a pyramid of hot dishes on their heads. The flower pots falling from high window ledges. Night, with the shuttered shops, the silence broken by some sudden street brawl, the darkness shaken by a flare of torches as some great man, wrapped in his scarlet cloak, passes along from a dinner party with his long train of clients and slaves. There is no evidence that both Peter and Paul were in Rome at the same time, or that Peter had preceded him. All rests on tradition, which, as has been seen, is very often right. Despite later tales that Paul extended his missionary voyages as far as Spain after an acquittal, it seems highly unlikely that he or Peter survived the Neronian persecution of the Christians, which followed on the Great Fire of Rome in 64. The story that Nero himself instigated this is, as Tacitus remarks, uncertain. It is highly unlikely. Even some of the emperor's possessions, including the palace he had built to link the Palatine Hill with the famous gardens of Maecenas, were destroyed. Nero, unstable though he was hardly the man to instigate a fire that destroyed 2/3 of his capital city. The people could not be compensated, even by the wise measures that Nero took in ensuring that, in the rebuilding of the capital of the world, only a small percentage of the new buildings might be of wood. The major part had to be of stone from Gabinum, or Albano, which was fireproof. The fire, no doubt, like the Great Fire of London, started entirely accidentally. As Rome was composed largely of wooden tenements, it would have spread swiftly from house to house if a wind was blowing. The firefighting services were inefficient. Nero had them considerably improved, ordering that in future every household should have its own firefighting apparatus. People had also been illicitly tapping the water supply, so that sufficient pressure was not available at certain key points. Prayers were offered up at various shrines, and the famous Sibylline books, the supposed repository of all wisdom, were consulted in attempts to discover how to appease the gods. But, to quote Tacitus, no human aid, no bounty from the emperor, no prayers to heaven, did anything to erase the popular impression that the fire had been started deliberately. Nero looked around for a scapegoat, and found an easy one in the most unpopular sect in Rome, the Christians. The Jews, with their arrogance, their extraordinary God, and their strange eating and social habits were bad enough, but even the Jews hated the Christians. Another good political reason for getting rid of them was that they denied the divinity of the emperor. They would make no formal concessions on this score, even as the Jews were prepared to do. Their founder, as Tacitus tells us, was one Christus, who had been put to death in the reign of Tiberius by the procurator Pontius Pilate. Infanticide, incest, and cannibalism, because of a misunderstanding of the Eucharist, were among the charges laid against them. This abominable superstition was held in check for a time, but then it spread not only throughout Judea, where it had started, but even to Rome itself, that enormous reservoir and natural home for every kind of filth and depravity. Tacitus, greatest of Roman historians, was an aristocrat by nature. He hated this slave religion just as much as he detested the Roman mob. The Christians were put to death amid every kind of mockery. Dressed in the skins of wild beasts, they were torn to pieces by dogs. They were crucified or burned to death. By night, they were strung up and set on fire. They were used as human torches to illuminate Nero's gardens, which he threw open to the public for their entertainment. Even Tacitus concludes his assessment of their treatment with the words, "Although they were guilty and deserved their fate, a kind of compassion for them spread among the people. They were being killed to satisfy the cruelty of one man, and were serving no public end." It is almost certain that, amid this Holocaust, Paul would have been one of the first to go. Whatever the fate of Peter, whether crucified upside down as tradition has it, Paul would, to the last, have been able to insist on the rights of a Roman citizen. There can be little doubt that he was beheaded. His dust, long since sifted with that of Caesars and of peasants, trembles somewhere beneath the roaring traffic of Rome. The kingdom still has not come. The words remain forever. Though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels, and have not charity, I am become as sounding brass, or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy, and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains, and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned, and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long, and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth. But whether there be prophecies, they shall fail. Whether there be tongues, they shall cease. Whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then shall I know, even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Explicit. This concludes the reading of Paul the Traveler by Ernle Bradford. This book was read by Walter Zimmerman.